All right, I'm going to walk you through the steps on how to take your data and put it into a spreadsheet so that it will automatically create a graph for you. And I'm going to be working with numbers, but you can use any spreadsheet app you want. And if you want to go old-fashioned, you can use a pencil and paper. All of that is fine with me as long as you are able to take your data and turn it into a meaningful graph. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up numbers. And in the top right corner, there's this plus sign. I'm going to go ahead and click that to create a new graph. And then I'm going to choose blank spreadsheet. And once you get to a blank spreadsheet, the first thing I'm going to point out is that these gray cells on the left-hand side and this first row, so the first column and first row that are gray, you cannot enter any data into them. They are only for your headers. They're only for information. And all data would have to be entered into the white cells for numbers to read it. So I'm going to use this first column to list out my trials. So trial number, and then I did trial 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I had 5 trials. If you had more, you would just keep working your way down the list and adding more as necessary. The second column is your independent variable. And I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about independent variable versus dependent variable. You can also think of independent and dependent as cause and effect. The dependent is the effect of the independent. It depends on what you've changed. So the independent, that's your cause, that's what you're changing. In this lab, I was changing the drop height and seeing how it affected the percent of energy lost. So your first column should be the drop height, and your effect should be the percent of energy lost. So in this cell, I'm going to add drop height. And when you're doing that, make sure you put your units in parentheses. So if you used inches, you would put inches in parentheses. If you used bricks, you would type bricks in parentheses. Whatever unit you used, add that in there. And the second column was energy lost. And we calculated that as a percentage. So now I have my column headers, I have my row trials, and now I'm just going to go ahead and enter my data. So my first drop height was 10 inches, and when I dropped it from 10 inches, I noticed I lost about 29% of the energy. And when I dropped it from 20 inches, I noticed that I lost 30% of your energy. So you just keep going through this, entering your data. At 20 inches, how much percent did you lose? At 30 inches, how much did you lose? And you add these in. At 40 inches, I lost about 33% of my energy. And at 50 inches, I lost another 31% of my energy. So now, once you've entered your data, you're going to select the data, and then it'll give you an option to automatically create a graph. So you're going to click your first one. So I clicked the 10 because that's my first cell. And notice in the bottom right corner, there's that little dot that's highlighted. You're going to click and hold that dot and drag it over all of your data. But don't stop there. Keep it held in and drag it down so you've highlighted a bunch of extra empty cells. And we do this in case you need, after you create a graph, if you realize you don't have enough data to really make a good analysis and determine what the relationship is, you can go back and add more data. And as long as you add it in cells that you've given yourself extra space to add to, it'll automatically put them into your graph. And you are going to add 2 extra ones to this. But you might as well keep going further because it doesn't hurt anything to highlight more blank cells, leaving yourself extra room to work. So once you let go of the dot after you've highlighted an extra long column, or 2 extra long columns, it'll give you these options at the top. You're going to choose cell actions so that you can choose create new chart. So we're going to create a new chart, and you're going to scroll down until you find this XY scatter plot, which is the blue and green pluses. So you're going to click that, and then bam, it's automatically going to take your data and convert it into a graph very easily for you. But now when I look at these data points, it looks like an absolute mess. I don't know why I have that mountain of data. But upon closer inspection, I look at the y-axis and I realize that it's scaled very oddly. It's scaled from 28 inches, my least amount of energy lost, to 33%, my largest percent of energy lost. 28% to 33%. So what we need to do is we need to add some fake data points into our graph. I don't know why I put that in quotes. They really are fake data points. We're going to put some fake data points into our graph, and we're going to put those fake data points in to scale it a little bit. Instead of starting with a percent energy of 28, I want to scale it all the way down to 0. So to do that, I'm just going to add a fake data point at 0, 0. So we come back up to these blank cells, and in your first blank cell, you enter 0, 0. And once you've added that, if you come back down to your graph, oh my goodness, look at that scaling. That looks so much better. It's so much more clean. It's neat. I love it. But now I'm going to do the same thing at the top end of things. Notice how I go to a max percent energy lost of 40%. I'm going to scale that a little bit bigger too. And the best way to do that is to take about 1.5 times whatever your biggest number on the y-axis is. In that case, my biggest number is 40. So I'm going to take 1.5 of 40, or 1.5 times 40. And you can plug that into a calculator if you need to, but 40 is a relatively easy number. 1.5 of 40 would be 60. So instead of going only up to 40, now I want my scale to go from 0 to 60 along the y-axis. And to do that, you add one more data point that will stretch it from 0 to 60. So now we've stretched our scale from 0 to 60 on the y-axis. And if we come back down to our graph, oh my goodness, that's a good looking graph. And of course it's a good looking graph. I made my numbers up. So your graph might not come out as cleanly as this, and that's okay. If yours didn't come out as cleanly, it's because you're working with real objects, with real numbers. And it's not always going to be pretty, and it's not always going to work out well. But hopefully, you at least get a curve in your data points or a straight line looking interpretation of your data points. That's the goal, is to get one of those two things. And again, in this lab, I'm not going to make you retest to get better data points to confirm for sure. But in future labs, you probably will have to collect extra data points to make sure that your trend is what you think it is. But for now, suffice it to say, we're satisfied with all of our graphs. So I'm going to take these, and you're going to have to add some titles. You're going to have to add a y-axis title, so we know it's graphed along the y-axis. You need to add an x-axis title, so we know it's graphed along the x. You need to add a chart title, so as soon as you see the chart, you know exactly what you're looking at. And then you need to add a curve or line of best fit. And I'm going to walk you guys through that, but the first thing we need to do is we need to save our graph and our table as screenshots. So first I'm going to take the graph and I'm going to create a screenshot of it. Just make sure the whole thing's in view and hit the menu button and the power button at the same time, and that'll take a screenshot of your entire screen. And now I'm going to take that screenshot in the bottom left and I'm going to click on it so that I can crop out everything I don't need. And notice in the corners there are these blue squares. I'm going to take those blue squares and I'm just going to drag them in until I get it cropped down so that only my graph is visible. Once I've done that, I'm just going to hit the done button and save it to my photos, so that way I can import it into Notability or your word processor of choice. We're going to take that same process and we're going to repeat it for the data table. So I'm going to take a screenshot and highlight it, and then cropping in the corners, I'm going to make sure to highlight my data and only my data. And keep in mind those two data points at the bottom aren't real data points, so I'm not going to include them in my screenshot. And I'm actually going to expand that a little bit. There we go. And once you've done that, you can click the done button and save that to your photos as well. So now that we have both of our photos, we're done in Google Sheets. So I'm going to close that app and I'm going to go into Notability. And whoops, that's not Notability. I'm going to go into Notability and I'm going to create a new document. Once you've created a new document, in this top right corner, you're going to click the plus sign. And from there, you're going to choose Photo Library, and you're going to add in your data table, and your graph. And we're going to insert those 2 photos. So now once you're here, if you click off of it, it looks like we only have our graph. Now, you can't do this next part while you're still highlighted with the pencil mark. You have to choose the text tool so that you can click on the object. So after clicking text, you can click on your graph with 1 finger, and then you can move it around. And you can do the same with your data table, and you can move those around as you please. And again, this will be slightly different if you're using Word or if you're using Pages, but the process is relatively the same. So now that I have these in there, I'm going to add my axes titles. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add the y-axis title, and we're just going to label it exactly what it is. That was the energy lost, but don't forget, you have to have the units in parentheses. I recommend zooming in and making it as neat as you possibly can. So energy lost, and that was measured in percent. And I'm going to repeat the same process along the x-axis, which was drop height, and that was measured in inches. Now that you've done that, you have to add a graph title. And your graph title for any scientific graph should be in the form of y versus x. Or in this case, energy lost versus drop height. Title is as simple as that. So now that we know that, we're going to put energy lost versus drop height. Energy lost versus drop height. And now we know exactly what graph we're looking at. And the last thing you need to do for your graph is to add a curve of best fit. And what you're going to do for that is you're going to look at your data, and keep in mind we don't care about the 0, 0, and we don't care about the 0, 60. They aren't real data points, so you don't want to consider them. You just want to consider these core data points. And you're either going to have a curve or a line, hopefully one of those two, and you may have to kind of guess on this first lab as to what you're looking at. And again, in the future, I will show you guys how to collect more data if you're unsure. But for now, take a stab, see what you have. Maybe you thought that this was a curve. If that's the case, you would just draw a curve that goes through your data as closely as it possibly can. But I don't think that curve really fits my data. So in that case, I think I actually have a line of best fit. To do that, you just draw a straight line through the heart of your data, and in Notability, you can keep your line held in, and it will turn it into a perfectly straight line. Easy for you. In fact, that should be, I think, a little bit lower, somewhere through there. There, I think that's a much better line of best fit. Now, a couple things I want to point out. This does not and should not go through every data point. Unless your data is absolutely perfect, it will not go through every data point. And don't ever force your data line through your points, or don't ever force your line of best fit through your data. You're just kind of trying to go through the heart of it. Do not ever connect the dots. That is bad data. So just one line through the heart of your data and you call it a day. So now I want to take 2 minutes and kind of go through the rubric with you guys. So I'm going to close this out and I'm going to go into the assignment. And for this rubric, you need 2 things. And we've actually covered everything in both of them, but I'm going to go through it line by line anyway. You need data, a data table, and you need a graph. So with the data table, the first thing you need is a table containing all data that you obtained or gleaned during the laboratory. Our data table contains that. It must include straight lines. So if you're using pencil and paper, this is where you break out the ruler. If you're doing it in numbers just like I did, it will automatically create straight lines for you. You need titles at the tops of your columns with units in parentheses, which I have. And you need at least 5 data points, which you should have and which I do have. Now, for the graph, it must have a title at the top in the form of Y versus X. Percent energy lost or energy lost versus drop height. We have that. We needed X and Y axes titles with units in parentheses. We had energy lost in percent and drop height in inches. And then we had energy lost was on the y-axis and drop height was along the x-axis. And whatever your independent variable is, whatever your cause is, that's always on the x, and your effect, your dependent variable, is on the y. So as x goes on, how does y change? As you change your cause, how does your effect change with it? That's the reason we're doing that. And you need to draw a curve or line of best fit, making sure not to connect the dots. That's super important. Do not ever connect the dots. And I think we've covered everything. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to let me know. And aside from that, thank you guys for sticking with me through this, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.